Partition didn't solve the Irish question. It took the difficult, perhaps the insoluble part of the question away and put it somewhere else. It put it in cold storage for a while, but it came back as insoluble questions always do.
In November 1918, Britain emerged from the First World War with its economy in tatters. Prime Minister David Lloyd George was trying to broker peace in Europe as national identities were being asserted and new states were emerging.
After the First World War, everything has shifted. We're heading into an age of democratic nation-states.
In Ireland, nationalist demands for independence from Britain had already resulted in an armed rebellion in 1916, and the bloody fallout radicalized public opinion.
Irish nationalists now moved from wanting devolved government within the UK to actual independence and separation from the UK for Ireland.
While nationalists wanted to break from centuries of British rule, in the industrial northeast of the island, many unionists feared the loss of their cultural and economic ties to Britain and the Empire.
They felt part of this imperial home, this Britishness. Their British consciousness was absolutely crucial.
As Irish nationalists engaged in a guerrilla war, in London, the government sought a new answer to a question that had long dominated British politics, and a radical solution to separate opposing sides on the island emerged.
There are a lot of conflicting emotions around the creation of the border, or that sense that this is not a temporary arrangement. This is a permanent monument to division.
This is the story of the dramatic events that led to the creation of two states. A story of political brinkmanship and brutal communal conflict that reverberates to this day, and which continues to dominate relationships between the islands of Britain and Ireland.
The history of this period is incredibly difficult, causing people to lose lives and for some people to lose faith in the states that they have been put in. So we should never forget that aspect of this history.
On the morning of the 22nd of June, 1921, the royal yacht brought King George V and Queen Mary to Belfast, the capital city of the new Northern Ireland.
The King and Queen arrive in Belfast in June 21 for the state opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament, arriving on the royal yacht, and they disembark and get onto a horse-drawn carriage, which is then drawn through the streets of Belfast, and the streets are festooned with bunting. There are huge crowds there.
We're very lucky to have newsreel footage of the day, and it certainly looks like a very grand occasion. The way the streets are decked out and the King and the Queen proceeding in their carriage, you can see how significant it was to Ulster Unionists.
Absent from the streets were the nationalist, mostly Catholic citizens of Northern Ireland, those who wanted no part of this new state and felt betrayed by a line on the map that separated them from the rest of the island.
There was flags and bunting, lampposts and pavements were painted red, white and blue. However, there was one community that wasn't there, that was the Catholic community. The Primate of All Ireland, Cardinal Logue, he turned down an invitation to the opening of the Parliament, saying he had a prior engagement.
A third of the population just aren't there at all. And, you know, all these buildings overlooking the celebrations are filled with armed men now. That's the reality of this new Northern Ireland.
This was a royal visit like no other. The King and Queen had come to a land where a bloody war to win independence from Britain still raged, and a city ravaged by sectarian violence. There were deep concerns for their safety.
The Times of London reports that in those crowds that we look at and we think those are all Belfast people, there are hundreds, plural, of detectives brought over from London. So you realise it's actually a big, high-risk event.
As the King and Queen arrived at Belfast City Hall, there to meet them was one of the main architects of Partition, and now the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, James Craig.
I would say that the King's visit to Belfast to open the Parliament was probably the best day of James Craig's life. The arrival of the King and Queen to put a stamp not just on this Northern Ireland, but on this Ulster Unionist movement, which, of course, you know, only a few years previously had been threatening rebellion now, had been out on a limb, and now having the King and Queen arriving, I think this is a wonderful moment. And there was huge celebration, of course.
The King made his way to the council chamber to deliver a highly anticipated speech. Drafted in Downing Street, with input from the King, it was an attempt to bring the War of Independence to an end.
So I'm now looking at the King's speech, the speech he made to at the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament. And this was the opening gambit, really, in that Lloyd George is prepared to enter negotiations and offer Ireland a place in the British Commonwealth of Nations. I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and forget, and to join in making for the land they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill.
While addressing the local dignitaries, the King was also speaking to nationalist leaders still waging guerrilla warfare on the island. Men such as Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins.
There's no question that the King is addressing the Republican movement more broadly. There's no talk about laying down your arms. There's no address to the Republican movement to do anything that could be described as defeatist. There is instead an appeal to it, to their better heart, their better nature, to say it's time to forgive and forget.
It is my earnest desire that in Southern Ireland, too, there may take place a parallel to what is now passing in this hall. I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards the end of strife amongst their people, whatever their race or creed.
A message had been sent. One, the Northern Ireland Parliament is here, and it's got a firm basis to it. And the second message is that the British government is open to talks. It's not interested in endless recrimination or revenge. It can't call on Irishmen to forgive and forget if it's not prepared itself to forgive and forget. So that key message does get through over the next few weeks.
With the King's speech, Lloyd George had made an impassioned plea for peace. But as the King and Queen departed from Belfast that night, rioting broke out on the city's streets, and worse was soon to follow.
The day after the opening of the Parliament, a troop train that was involved in the ceremony was actually attacked by the IRA in Adavoil, which is on the Louth-Armagh border, where 4 men and 80 horses were killed.
Despite public outrage at the attack on the train, the following day, Lloyd George wrote to Sinn Féin's Eamon de Valera proposing a truce. De Valera consented, and on the 9th of July, the truce was signed. 5 days later, as president of the independent republic that nationalists had declared and been fighting to establish, de Valera made his way to Downing Street.
When de Valera came to Downing Street, Lloyd George had a map of the British Empire put on the wall with extra red to emphasise the dominance of Britain. And he was trying to create this atmosphere that de Valera and Ireland could join the British Commonwealth as an equal.
Lloyd George and De Valera were a wonderful match for each other. Lloyd George had what somebody described as a kingfisher quickness. De Valera was absolutely the reverse. Serious, solemn, upright, not giving anything away. Lloyd George said that dealing with De Valera was like picking up quicksilver with a fork.
De Valera suggested some sort of plebiscite or referendum. But at the same time, he said any separate representative assembly or anything in Northern Ireland would have to answer to Dublin, not to London. And this would always be utterly unacceptable to James Craig and his associates. What they had, they would hold, and they would look to the larger island, not ever to Dublin.
James Craig viewed the treaty negotiations in London with suspicion. While there was a truce between the British government and the IRA, sectarian violence continued in Belfast. Just 4 days before De Valera arrived at Downing Street, 14 people were killed in what became known as Belfast's Bloody Sunday. With perceived enemies within and uncertain friends at Westminster, for Craig, it seemed his fledgling state was already under threat.
Craig was wary of Lloyd George, who wanted to get a deal more than anything. One of the things that Lloyd George tried to convince Craig to do in the summer, in July 1921, was for Northern Ireland to be in an All-Ireland Parliament within Dublin, something vehemently opposed by Ulster Unionists. So although Northern Ireland was up and running, its future and its makeup was not certain at that stage.
Craig is very, very apprehensive indeed about these conversations between Lloyd George and the Sinn Féin leadership. He has no trust of Lloyd George whatsoever. He is keenly aware that the direction of these talks may end up as being extremely threatening to the partition settlement, which he has just overseen.
Craig's fears were shared by fellow Unionists at the heart of his new administration. People of influence such as the Vane Tempest Stewart family of Mount Stewart in County Down.
So we're in the bedroom of Edith, 7th Marchioness of Londonderry. She succeeded with her spouse, Charlie, to the titles. By 1921, she was exerting some influence on her spouse to accept a position in the new Northern Ireland Parliament. Charlie VII, Marquess, having taken up a position of Minister for Education in the new Northern Parliament. He was aware that they were targets for a lot of the unrest which was unfolding in the north at this time. So what we see is members of the Northern Parliament, like the Londonderrys, being guarded by the B Specials, being accompanied by detectives. Although we often think about that very dark and difficult period as being largely urban-based violence, we also have examples of it moving beyond Belfast and Derry and actually coming to a place like Mount Stewart. The new state offers opportunities, and for a woman like Edith to be advising her husband and continue also their political entertaining in London, and how this isn't just going to be about the new Northern Parliament, it's about having those connections in Westminster to protect that unionist interest. And again, another reminder of how insecure they actually felt.
The July talks between Lloyd George and De Valera ended in stalemate. But 3 months later, a full Sinn Féin delegation arrived in London for formal negotiations. It included the IRA commander who had been directing the guerrilla warfare against Britain and masterminded the assassination of many of its security personnel, Michael Collins. But absent from the delegation was Collins' rival within Sinn Féin, Eamon De Valera.
It's difficult to know why the treaty delegates didn't include De Valera. He had gone there in the summer, he'd seen Lloyd George. There are all sorts of theories why. One is that he didn't expect them to produce anything and would prefer not to be associated. The other is that his rivalry with Collins was already coming into focus, and he wanted this to destroy Collins's career. You can be very speculative about this. We will never know.
For Lloyd George and the British government, the talks were not only about the future of Britain's relationship with Ireland, but the future of the empire.
The negotiations of Sinn Féin and the British government were eagerly watched by nationalists in India. If Britain was perceived to be weak in handling Irish insurrection, then that could be exploited by opponents in India.
I think for Lloyd George, on one level, his own political future was at stake. But it's also, this is a question of, can British governance handle complicated constitutional questions that relate to self-determination and the emergence of nation statehood from the empire? And so it's trying to find a formulation that actually enables Britain to, really hold quite a lot of the rights and control while giving people a sense of autonomy, of self-determination, but in a fairly confined way.
Sinn Féin's ideal position would have been to achieve complete sovereignty as an independent republic. It seems the best they could probably hope for was that the agreement that would be reached would lead eventually towards the goal of a completely independent republic. And I also think they hoped to have something in that agreement which would help them achieve eventual unity. But it's important to remember that going into the treaty negotiations, the Sinn Féin position was not about ending partition. It was about the extent of sovereignty which they could get for the 26-county state.
Throughout the treaty negotiations, Lloyd George insisted Ireland remain within the British Empire, with the Crown as head of state. To secure Sinn Féin's agreement, he urged the Ulster Unionist leader James Craig to accept an all-Ireland parliament with a regional administration in Belfast.
Pressure is put on him in November, which he resists very effectively. Lloyd George turns to him and says, look, the way we're thinking about this, you need to make some sacrifices to reach a deal here. Otherwise, we're not going to get the deal that we want.
What Britain didn't want was for the talks to be collapsed on the Ulster question because they knew they hadn't got a strong case. Britain didn't feel it could robustly defend the partition of a small island. But they also realised that James Craig is going to sit on Ulster and not budge.
Failing to win concessions from Craig, Lloyd George turned to Sinn Féin and proposed a new all-Ireland parliament with independence in its domestic affairs. But crucially, Northern Ireland could opt out and remain within the United Kingdom, in which case a boundary commission would be established to determine the line of the border.
Because the treaty had built into it a boundary commission that would reconsider the boundaries of Northern Ireland, this was expected by the treaty negotiators to make Northern Ireland unviable and to be the first step towards reunifying the whole island.
When you think about the implications of the fact that Southern nationalists are now going to sign this treaty, Sinn Féin has now accepted partition. Because no matter where the border is going to be drawn by this commission, there's still going to be a thing called Northern Ireland. So it's very important, the treaty, because it does accept partition now as a reality.
With their proposals for an Irish Free State and a boundary commission that would redraw the border in line with the wishes of local inhabitants, Lloyd George and his negotiators set out to drive the talks with Sinn Féin to a conclusion.
What Lloyd George did was to take the most amenable of the Irish delegation, that's to say Griffith and Collins, and to negotiate with them, eventually saying to them, look, you've got to sign, but there will be war unless you sign. This was, I think, a bluff. I don't think he was intent on doing that at all, but this put huge pressure on the Irish delegation.
Believing a redrawing of the border by the Boundary Commission would hand large parts of Northern Ireland to the south and make it unworkable, the Irish delegation succumbed to pressure and signed the treaty. But deeply conflicted by its terms, Collins said that he had, in fact, signed his own death warrant.
The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed under threat of immediate and terrible war. Whether David Lloyd George was bluffing or not, we don't know, but were the delegation from Sinn Féin in a position to call his bluff? That was a whole other question. That was a huge responsibility that was placed on their shoulders. They had to begin to think of what the alternative to signing the treaty was.
They would accept in the end Dominion status for the 26 county unit, which would be called the Irish Free State. And the basic thing that they accepted was a continuing relationship with the Commonwealth.
It seemed that Lloyd George might have settled the Irish question, one that had defeated many of his predecessors.
Lloyd George was absolutely delighted by the outcome. He'd done something which Gladstone hadn't been able to do, which Asquith hadn't been able to do, and which was to find a solution. It wasn't an ideal solution, it didn't suit everybody, it had all sorts of problems attached to it, but nevertheless, it was a solution to the Irish problem.
With the establishment of the two states, the British government hoped that it could withdraw from the Irish question. Don't forget, the Irish question had paralysed British politics since 1886. Getting Irish politics out of British politics seemed to be achieved by this settlement.
Lloyd George had secured peace and kept Ireland within the Empire. But as Collins had feared, the deal provoked a split within Sinn Féin, with pro- and anti-treaty factions led by himself and Eamon de Valera. Following heated debates in the Dáil, the unofficial assembly in Dublin, in January 1922, the treaty was approved by a majority of 7. Now Britain prepared to hand over power.
What happens on the 16th of January with the handover of Dublin Castle is obviously very symbolic, but in some ways it's also a little bit misleading. It suggests that there's a kind of an agreed and controlled handover of power. The real situation is much more chaotic, and the Republican movement is completely divided. A lot of what happens over the next 6 months, the first 6 months of 1922, violence north and south, exists because there's a kind of a power vacuum.
While the terms of the treaty created turmoil in Dublin, James Craig's response in Belfast was unequivocal.
Craig was apoplectic with anger when he read the terms of the treaty. First of all, the Boundary Commission, which threatened the integrity of Craig's Northern Ireland. And from that very moment, he said he would refuse to have anything to do with it. His policy became not an inch.
Ulster Unionists thought at the time of the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament that this was a permanent settlement. And the treaty appeared to be bringing this into jeopardy. This prospect of a commission ruling that certain pieces of Northern Ireland's territory had to be ceded to the south. And the fear, of course, among Unionists was, and the hope among nationalists was, that if this territory to be ceded to the south was substantial enough, then Northern Ireland as a political or economic unit would not really be viable.
There are fears that major towns or cities will be shifted from Northern Ireland to the south. Unionist fears focusing on key locations like Newry and Derry.
While Unionists feared a redrawing of the border, many nationalists hoped the Boundary Commission might deliver them from the northern state, one in which they felt trapped.
Pro-treatyites had insisted the Boundary Commission would potentially give a lot of Northern Territory over to the south, and there was good reason for thinking that Fermanagh and Tyrone, for example, had Catholic majorities. Derry was seen as a Catholic city, so there was expectations that big changes of territory would take place.
All nationalists North and South were overly optimistic of the Boundary Commission, believing huge parts of the North would be transferred to the Irish Free State and the rest would become an unviable rump.
As furious debates continued in Dublin, hopes raised by the Boundary Commission were used to try and stem unease over the terms of the treaty.
From the point of view of Collins and Griffith, this enables them to sell the treaty in Dublin by saying partition is not permanent. We know there are narrow nationalist majorities in Tyrone and in Fermanagh, and this entity that is called Northern Ireland is a temporary actuality.
Michael Collins was also employing another strategy to bring about an end to partition. As Director of Intelligence for the IRA, through a campaign of violence along the border, he sought to destabilise the northern state that James Craig was trying to build.
On the one hand, he was accepting the terms of the treaty clearly, which involved Northern Ireland staying as it was, pending the Boundary Commission. On the other hand, he's certainly licensing IRA operations on the border. Terrible things are happening in Northern Ireland in the early months of 1922.
With tensions mounting in Dublin and violence intensifying along the border, Lloyd George and Winston Churchill instigated a series of meetings in London. Two bitter enemies, Michael Collins and James Craig, were about to come face to face.
The two men met, and Churchill described them as glowering ferociously at one another. And he said that he thought that the best way to treat them was to let them get on with it together and supply them with copious supplies of lamb chops.
Some beer and mutton chops were introduced. That produced an agreement. Basically, they agreed to look again at the Boundary Commission and try to seek a way of avoiding the construct of the Commission and settling the matter by a personal agreement.
But the personal agreement in London would be short-lived. When Collins and Craig met again in Dublin 12 days later, the differences between them were to prove irreconcilable.
At that meeting, negotiations broke down because, in Craig's words, Collins showed him a map suggesting that at least half the territorial area of Northern Ireland would go south in the event of a Boundary Commission. And Collins was really pressing Craig to accept an all-Ireland settlement, a federal Ireland, if you like. Well, Craig came home in high dudgeon, and almost immediately, Collins realised this pact wasn't going to work.
While he had been negotiating with Craig, Collins was also intensifying the IRA's campaign of violence.
Certainly in this early phase, I think the focus of the IRA is along the border. Specials, for example, straying too close to the border, are shot, are kidnapped. There's a lot of sniping takes place across the border as well.
Increased IRA attacks on the border in turn provoked reprisals on Catholics in Belfast.
There's a lot of tit-for-tat sectarian killing going on. The IRA is definitely active at this point, and at the same time, the Special Constabulary seem to be in cahoots with loyalist gangs.
By and large, when we're looking at what's happening in Belfast, it's massive-scale communal violence. It's also shrouded in confusion. Quite often, it's very difficult to work out who is killing who, such is the scale of the violence.
This reaches a crescendo on the 23rd, 24th of March, 1922, probably the worst day of the Troubles, which had been gestating for 2 years. We're standing at the corner of Kinnaird Place and Kinnaird Terrace on the Antrim Road in Belfast. And it was in this street that one of the darkest deeds in the history of the Belfast Troubles of the 1920s occurred. On that night, the McMahon family, at number 3 here, had just gone to bed. Owen McMahon, in his 50s, a wealthy publican, his wife Eliza, their 5 sons, a barman who lived in the attic. A group of 5 assassins made their way to number 3. They had a sledgehammer, which they used to break down the door. Owen McMahon, his wife Eliza, were awakened. She got up and suddenly saw a man in police uniform, RIC uniform, on the stairs, followed by 4 men. They were all carrying revolvers. And suddenly all the menfolk were being lined up downstairs in the house. There were Owen McMahon, 5 sons, the youngest, age 12, and the man in the trench coat stood with his revolver and said, "Do you boys say prayers?" And at that moment, he began to fire into the group. The firing stopped, the gunmen decamped, and Mrs. McMahon rushed into the room. You could see the women's footprints in the kind of soggy, bloody floor the following day. No one was ever prosecuted for the McMahon family murders, but the finger of suspicion always pointed at District Inspector John Nixon, later an independent Unionist MP. It's a defining event that sets a tone to the birth of Northern Ireland in the early 1920s. It really goes to the heart of the polarisation around partition, around the events of these years, 1920 to 1922.
And this is really one of the most shocking images we have of violence in Belfast, and indeed violence during the whole Irish Revolutionary period. We can see the 5 members of the McMahon family laid out for their funerals. And this image would have been seen globally. In the House of Commons, there were debates about what was happening in Belfast. This image, too, would have been deeply shocking and unnerving for the nationalist community. It really would have brought home to them how vulnerable their status was in the new state, when even the security forces were involved in violence of this kind.
From Craig's perspective, killings such as the McMahon killings seem to demonstrate to British opinion and to the outside world that he is incapable or maybe even unwilling of looking after the Northern nationalist minority. And this, I think, ratchets up the pressure on him from London and indeed from international opinion generally.
Following the outcry at the McMahon killings, Churchill summoned Craig and Collins to London for a 3rd face-to-face meeting. And it seemed that finally, progress was made.
At the end of it all, it is announced peace is hereby declared, and also a clear commitment on the part of the Unionist government to remodel its security forces and also to do what it can in Belfast to get Catholics back into the shipyards and so on. It's a commitment basically to fairer treatment for Catholics in the north, and their obvious strategy is by these means we are gaining the effective acknowledgement and recognition from the government in Dublin. So that's how it ends.
The pact was signed by Collins and Craig and countersigned by others. Now, of course, the pact would eventually, if you like, evaporate in the sunlight of reality.
Collins' border campaign continued to not only undermine Northern Ireland, but also distract from the growing tensions in the south, where Republicans angrily debated the treaty that he had signed. The spectre of a dangerous split loomed.
From Collins's perspective, the split in the IRA was the biggest threat because it held the prospect of some sort of conflict breaking out among these former comrades. Because they couldn't agree on the treaty, well, there was one thing they could agree on, which was trying to undermine the new state of Northern Ireland. So we see Collins using volunteers from the south as part of a border campaign in the spring of 1922. One glue that he could use to try to keep them together for as long as possible was this prospect of joint action on Northern Ireland.
Alarmed by the IRA's continuing border campaign and the assassination in Belfast of Unionist MP William Twaddell, James Craig took decisive action, with far-reaching implications for Northern Ireland.
Craig brought in the Special Powers Act, and that effectively meant the civil government could suspend civil liberties and effectively bring in martial law, and this was deemed necessary to clamp down on the level of violence that was occurring in Northern Ireland at the time.
Under that act, there's flogging. It's not liberal, it's ferocious. And there is no question that, that this sort of legislation is very, very unfortunate from the point of view of the image of Northern Ireland, internally and externally.
Faced with an increasingly hostile and sectarian state, thousands of people from both sides of the divide in Northern Ireland sought refuge elsewhere, with many nationalists travelling south.
So you can see here the arrival of Belfast refugees in Dublin. This is probably in June 1922. These poor people, traumatised. I mean, look at that poor child, you know, carrying their little possessions wrapped in bundles. So these have just managed to escape the savagery of Belfast and now are looking at this uncertain future in Dublin. I think there is a general sense when we get to the height of the violence in May 1922 that the northern state isn't functioning. And you know, the British are, I think, seriously considering perhaps renegotiating the whole basis of partition.
The British government's concerns would be heightened by the dramatic events that took place in May and June 1922 in the northern Irish village of Beleak, on the border between Fermanagh and Donegal.
At the end of May 1922, there's a major incursion by the IRA into the town of Beleak. It's a huge security issue for the British government and for the fledgling Northern Ireland state. Now, Craig attempts to try and deal with the situation himself, and he commits a certain amount of troops of peace specialists to try and secure the area, but is unable to do so. The British government then decides to take matters in their own hands, and they commit a large force with artillery, air support, etc., to try and secure the town and to reclaim this contested border area.
Just 5 months after helping draft the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the man who ordered the British military response was the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill.
Some people say that if it hadn't been Winston Churchill's decision in London, there would not have been the strong reaction, which was in this case that the British government is not going to accept this incursion and we're going to use force and the British Army to drive these people out.
For James Craig, this is his worst nightmare. From a security point of view, it's a disaster. And ultimately, the British have to take matters into their own hands. So we're looking at the newsreel footage of the Battle of Beleak, and we see a large group of the Staffordshire Regiment, and they're moving in to reclaim the town. So the footage moves then to the top of the hill here to Beleak Fort, and they're firing field gun artillery into the main street of Beleak in an attempt to dislodge the insurgents. What we see then is British troops actually coming into the fort, reclaiming this for the British state, and they remove the tricolour which has been hanging here from Beleak Fort.
Communities on both sides of the border suffered as attacks continued. And in the County Armagh townland of Altnavay, they were to become even more bloody.
Insofar as you can say that the great atrocity from a Catholic point of view was the murder of the McMahon family, the great atrocity from the Protestant point of view is the murder of 6 people in Altnavay near Newry, close to the border. This was a planned operation, and it was the work of the 4th Northern Division of the IRA.
A group of 6 Protestant farmers were shot dead in their homes by a group of approximately 30 IRA men who were based in an IRA training camp in Ravensdale in County Louth.
They fire into the windows, there's bombs thrown, some people are shot on their doorstep, and at the end of the day, there's 6 people in total killed. And it is a dreadful atrocity, a dreadful sectarian atrocity.
5 men and 1 woman were shot dead. The lady was Elizabeth Crozer, was the wife of one of the farmers. It seems like they didn't intend to shoot her. One of the IRA men involved in the incident, James Marin, later in his application for a military service pension, later said, "The unfortunate part of it all was we shot dead 1 woman accidentally, the head of a large family. This got on my nerves and preyed on my mind." This was quite a shocking event locally. There's a lot of speculation as to what the reason for it was. Another key question is what, if any, was the role of Frank Aiken, the main IRA commander, who of course went on to a very stellar political career in independent Ireland afterwards. Aiken doesn't seem to have been there in person, but it is highly unlikely that an event like that would have been carried out by the IRA unit in an area under his command without his, at least his knowledge, if not his approval.
Now, just 6 months after the settlement that he hoped would deliver peace, Lloyd George was confronted with ongoing violence in Northern Ireland and a standoff between pro- and anti-treaty forces in the south.
There was fear that Craig would retaliate against the ambushes and attacks that were occurring on the border. So it was a very delicate situation that Lloyd George and Churchill were in, and they both felt that the whole thing would collapse.
It's clear by early June 1922 that the British government absolutely feared that this whole partition settlement is on the brink of collapse. You think not just what's going on in Northern Ireland, of course, but what's going on in the south as well. The anti-treaty IRA are running amok. They're occupying all these key buildings in Dublin. The provisional government itself is barely functioning. And in the north, we just have this complete trail of destruction. And this, of course, has a lot to do with the whole partitionist issue itself. The fact is, you've got these intransigent minorities now in both of these states, either political or religious, and they're becoming troublesome.
On the 22nd of June, the violence reached the streets of London when IRA gunmen killed the former head of the British Army, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson.
The assassination of Sir Henry Wilson, who was the security advisor to the Northern Ireland government, was seen by Lloyd George as a deliberate attack on the treaty settlement. The British government demanded that the Irish provisional government in the south of Ireland take action to clamp down on the IRA. And that effectively was a key factor in triggering the Civil War.
In response to the assassination, Churchill demanded that Collins take action against the anti-treaty forces, beginning with those who had occupied the forecourts in Dublin 2 months earlier. It was a demand accompanied by a threat.
Churchill is saying to Collins, if you do not get control over the anti-treaty forces, well, we'll move in again.
Collins succumbed to the pressure, and with artillery provided by the British Army, his Free State forces opened fire on the forecourts. The Irish Civil War had begun.
The anti-treaty IRA is going in its own direction, and Michael Collins does become firmer, he does become more resolute, that patience has been exhausted, that all avenues of possible compromise have been exhausted, and it's now time for decisive action.
With former IRA comrades now turning their guns on each other in the south, there were benefits for James Craig's emerging administration in Northern Ireland.
Once the Civil War breaks out in the south, All that pressure in 1922, which is on Craig, which leads him into these pacts with Collins, all that pressure evaporates just like that.
The North is more or less put on hold. Suddenly, it's the fight for the Free State in the South.
Just 2 months later, in August 1922, the Civil War was to take a dramatic turn and claim its most high-profile victim, when Michael Collins was killed in an anti-treaty IRA ambush in County Cork. With Collins' death, Northern nationalists lost their most vocal advocate in the new Southern administration.
Many Northern IRA members and Northern nationalists believed that Michael Collins was the only one who was interested in their affairs. In fact, Lloyd George said to Churchill that all Michael Collins would talk about was the North. They couldn't get him to talk about anything else. So with him out of the equation, nationalists felt that they no longer were of interest to the Southern administration.
The death of Collins does allow an opportunity for other voices to assert themselves in the provisional government. There's a recognition that the focus now needs to be on the survival of the Free State as opposed to trying to pursue the reunification of Ireland, to fundamentally change the provisional government's policy towards Northern Ireland.
When Collins is replaced by somebody like Cosgrave, somebody who's much more pragmatic, willing to work the settlement as it then stood, I think that this brings a great deal of relief to Craig and the ruling Unionists in the North.
James Craig wrote to the provisional government in Dublin to sympathise on the passing of perhaps his greatest adversary, Michael Collins, and that of Arthur Griffith 10 days earlier. When he received this telegram from Cosgrave in response, it seemed that the tide was turning in his favour. Craig's position was further strengthened in October 1922, when Conservative MPs ended their support for Lloyd George's coalition government, and he was forced to resign as Prime Minister.
When Lloyd George was deposed as leader of the coalition, that meant that Andrew Bonar Law became the Prime Minister. He was the key advocate of Unionist resistance to Home Rule before the war. Now he was in charge, and you could say that the Northern Ireland government was effectively secure.
According to the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the Free State officially came into being on the 6th of December, 1922. But the terms also stated that Northern Ireland had 1 month, the so-called Ulster month, to opt out. Sending a powerful message to Dublin and London, Craig exercised this right within a day, and the partition of Ireland was confirmed. But there remained one final stumbling block to Northern Ireland's future. The final line of the border was still to be determined by the Boundary Commission, one of the conditions agreed in the Treaty of 1921. But while its work was yet to begin, in border areas, partition was already a reality.
Petticoat is a small village that borders counties Donegal and Fermanagh. Before customs, partition for many people was just an administrative inconvenience. But with the introduction of customs, it really affected people's day-to-day lives. Customs was introduced by the Irish Free State in 1923, and soon afterwards, customs huts, some of them very temporary in nature, were introduced and sprung up all along the border region, that 300-mile meandering border. You've got a small village here of just about 400 people cut in half. Normal day-to-day events like going shopping, meeting friends, going to church services, that was all changed by the creation of the border, and particularly by the imposition of customs.
The formality of the border was a remarkable innovation. The border had followed county lines, and these are rather illogical lines. There were famous instances of the border going across someone's farmyard, or in one famous case, through the middle of someone's house. And yet it was a border.
With the precise line of the border yet to be determined, many nationalists and unionists who felt trapped in the wrong state still held out hope that the Boundary Commission might change their future.
Northern nationalists are being, of course, fed a great deal of propaganda prior to the Boundary Commission. Their expectation is that the Boundary Commission itself is going to deliver them eventually now into the state of their choice.
Despite James Craig's dogged refusal to engage with it, the Boundary Commission was finally formed in 1924. But from the outset, its progress was slow and fraught with difficulties.
The first commissioner to be appointed was Owen MacNeill, the Irish Free States Commissioner. That was followed almost a year later by the chairperson of the committee, Justice Feetham from South Africa. And because Northern Ireland refused to appoint their commissioner, the British government appointed Joseph R. Fisher. They couldn't have picked a better representative. He was a firm unionist, a former editor of the Northern Whig newspaper in Belfast.
This is the Belfast newsletter, December the 23rd, 1924. You can see Fisher, who is the Northern representative, then Owen MacNeill, who said it was the most awful tour he ever did in his life. They're literally walking the edges of the counties to try and understand the topography of the lines drawn on the map.
The three commissioners convened interviews from late 1924 to summer of 1925, where they held 500 interviews.
Before the actual report is published, it's leaked to the right-wing press in the shape of the Morning Post. What it basically recommends is some very gentle trims to the border as it stands at the 6 counties. And of course, in response to that, all hell breaks loose now in the south.
When this newspaper article became known, W.T. Cosgrave, the president of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State, he pleaded ignorance to the findings and rushed over to London to have the report shelved.
At Downing Street, Cosgrave had urgent talks with James Craig and the new British Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. Eventually, a deal was struck. There would be financial inducements for the South, including the cancellation of its share of the imperial debt from the First World War. But the border would stay as it was.
1925, you have the tripartite deal, which winds up all the loose ends from the conflict. It's only at that point that Craig has what he wants, which is unambiguous recognition by Dublin of the legitimacy of the Northern Ireland Parliament. And it's not something you can change by changing your constitution. It's a treaty in international law.
I think that Craig emerges from the Boundary Commission in an extremely relieved condition. I think that the Boundary Commission had represented a very serious set of challenges to James Craig and to the existence of the northern state.
For Northern nationalists who had pinned their hopes on the Boundary Commission, the final decision to leave the border unchanged provoked a sense of betrayal.
I think the final report of the Boundary Commission confirmed to Northern nationalists they were being abandoned. In the longer term, it led Northern nationalists perhaps to take a more realistic approach towards the fact that they were likely to be within a Northern Ireland state for quite some time.
It was an emotion shared by unionist communities in the southern counties of Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal. But for the British government, it seemed it had found a political solution that might be used to calm other troubled corners of its empire.
When Ireland is partitioned, it's both a story of success and of failure as far as countries like India are concerned. It's a story of success because it produces an independent country, but of course it's a story of failure because that country has been partitioned. So Ireland serves as a negative example once it is partitioned.
the partition of Ireland became a model. When Britain was going from India or Palestine, they saw partition as the solution because they deemed that they were not responsible for the ethnic divisions. Now, they might have been. Historians will look at the divisions in India and Palestine and say the British had a lot to answer for. But in terms of practical politics, it was a way out at the end of empire.
With the Act of Partition behind them, the new administrations in the north and south of Ireland began the process of state building. A process with marked differences and striking similarities.
On both sides of the border, we had minorities left in jurisdictions where they would have preferred not to be. But I think it's also worth looking at how partition affected the majorities in both of those areas. Northern nationalists would point to a discriminatory legislation, and many Southern Protestants would point to the overly Catholic nature of the Irish Free State. Perhaps the majorities were allowed to implement policies because they had so much power in both jurisdictions.
On both sides of the border, the administrations get on with the business of cementing themselves in power. What you get in Northern Ireland has been described, of course, as a Protestant state for a Protestant people. In many respects, the Free State was a Catholic state for a Catholic people.
By creating two Irelands, both stereotypes were, if you like, underwritten with a certain amount of complacency and conservatism on both sides.
You're creating states, essentially, that have to reinforce their own legitimacy. And you create immediately this kind of partitionist story of Ireland to match the actual physical partition of Ireland that's happening. And I think that's one of the greatest tragedies for Ireland.
History doesn't provide easy lessons. It doesn't provide instant or simple solutions, but I think the kinds of questions that are relevant in 1920, 1921, these questions have an abiding resonance for the people of Ireland today.
I think if you look at how Northern Irish politics functions, I think if you look at how Northern Irish identity functions, you can't really make sense of those things without thinking of this place as a place that has been framed by partition. In that sense, I think we're still very much living with the legacy of partition.
Partition cuts very deep, and it is about more than that physical border that was put in place. We think about splits that came in political movements, and such deep, lasting and often very bitter divisions is also a very big part of this history.
There is a fundamental problem that you've got a clash of two rights. It's not a clash between right and wrong. The case for a united Ireland is abstractly a perfectly reasonable case. The case the other side, that there are two nations on the island and therefore you need two political entities or two peoples on the island that reflect this fact, is also a reasonable case. You're dealing with two great rights, and it's a tragic conflict because they both abstractly have right on their side.